Absolutely not, Brittany.
Can you get the light on?
I'm just glad you said it, Allie.
Let's get the spread.
Let's do it.
Are we good now? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a yes. And is this, I'm assuming this is a good volume if no one's saying anything. Cool. The resolution, the United States federal government should significantly increase its funding for rare earth element mining in the United States, the framework. The first argument is that the role of the judges to vote for the team with the best method to disrupt colonial violence. The role of the judges to vote for the team with the best method to disrupt colonial violence. The ace point of this, that colonialism is a universal phenomenon that is experienced locally. The beast point is that status quo approaches to policymaking are incapable of resolving colonial violence. The CISA point is that we must understand how colonialism is spurred by current policy approaches to prevent error replication. The second argument is that the present situation demands acts of decolonial thinking that shifts the way that we confront crisis as an act of epistemic disobedience. The ace point under this, that decoloniality relies on theory and praxis because it presupposes a simultaneous recognition of the resistance against colonial constructions. The beast point is that it recognizes and undoes the structure of race, gender, and heteropatriarchy and class that continue to control life, knowledge, spirituality, and thought, structures that are clearly intertwined with and constitutive of global capitalism and Western modernity. The CISA point is that it's not static, but rather advances to different perspectives by acknowledging the need to take seriously the epistemic force of local histories and to think of theory through the political practice of subaltern groups. The third argument is that theia is an act of imagining the world as it isn't currently, which is a critical tool for disrupting colonial invasion because it enables praxis. The ace point under this is that fiat allows us to affirm the resolution through decolonial methods as we reflexively question our own theoretical justifications and practices and how we play this game of debate. The beast point is that decoloniality is a prior question, is the ongoing process. It requires us to create spaces that are inclusive, respectful, and also honor indigenous knowledge. Decolonization is an ongoing process that requires all of us to be collectively involved and responsible. Decolonizing your institutions means creating spaces that are inclusive, respectful, and honor indigenous people. The fourth argument is that refusing to engage in interrogations of colonial invasion leads to error replication and inevitably replicates the harms of colonial violence. The harms. The first argument is that U.S. policies towards natives and renewable energy technology reify settler logics. The ace point of this that solar and wind farms on native is that of solar and wind farms on native lands. The history and politics of natural resource use and development on reservation lands is often a site of intense debate and conflict as tribes are increasingly connecting to the network of renewable energy activism as a means of economic growth, ecological protection, and cultural preservation. The beast point is that in 2003, the first utility-scale indigenous-owned and operated wind turbine in the United States was installed on the Rosebud Chicago Lakota Reservation in South Dakota. The project took 8 years of organizing, fundraising, and coordinating among the tribal government, the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy, the Department of Energy, local activists, and the indigenous NGO Honor the Earth. The beast point is that Bob and Co. of the ICOUP explains that the technology is being used to promote a wider campaign for renewable energy on other reservations. This turbine could have been a standalone project, and the tribe would have been pleased enough. However, this is being used to apply to other reservations. The beast point is that despite this environmental justice, the United States federal government continues to encroach on cultural sites. In several of these cases, the environmental justice activists are challenging tribal governments' contracts with regional utilities and federal agencies. The east point is that these installations have become intermeshed with ongoing indigenous environmental justice campaigns focused on conflicts centering energy production, like the proposed mining of the sacred Zuni Salt Lake and the proposed federal nuclear waste storage sites on the Valley Goshute Reservation at the Yucca Mountain and uranium mining of the Navajo and Hopi reservations. The point under this, that in other words, when some of the most important cultural resources is the land itself, i.e. to have ceremonies and rituals and also to use it as resources for society to protect nature is also to protect this culture. The second argument is that decolonial resistance is paramount. The ace point of this, that decolonial resistance means decentering ourselves in the struggle against climate change. It means an understanding that any new Green New Deal or Green Industrial Revolution cannot be bound within our nation's borders or prioritize the well-being of Westerners over Black and brown lives in the rest of the world. The beast point of this, that as we make moves towards climate emergency, it's important that progressives do not internalize the colonial principles that got us in this mess by either simply ignoring the global historical context of resistance to emergency issues or even actively arguing that we should underdevelop Bombay to deliver growth in Wigan. The C's point of this is that decolonial resistance also means taking responsibility and ending current colonial practices. It means no more incrementalism. It means immediately dismantling the neo-colonial role played by our mining and energy companies to the world, just contributing to our fair share of global transfer of wealth needed for mitigation programs in the global south, and breaking the political bond between Washington and the fossil fuel industry. The third argument also means radically changing the role we play in global climate negotiations, which has historically been one of talking over the sharpest edge of climate change chaos. These negotiations need to be democracy, legally binding, democratic, and legally binding, and in a space in which we can learn and then take action. The fourth argument is in order for settlers to make a place their home, they must destroy and disappear the indigenous peoples that live there. Indigenous peoples that have creation stories, not colonization stories, about how they came to be in a particular place and how they came to be a particular space there. Relationships to land comprise of epistemologies, ontologies, and cosmologies. For the settlers, indigenous people are in the way, and the destruction of indigenous peoples, indigenous communities, and over time through law and policy, indigenous peoples claim to land under settled regimes. Land is recast as a property and as a resource. The impact is an endless violence. Colonialism's violence is not just physical violence, but a genocide of both the body and mind through erasure of non-European cultures. The ace point of this, that the genocide is a consequence of colonialism. The beast point is that one of the features of coloniality is its connection to the economy based on the dispensability of human life, which is seen as a commodity whereby you sell sugar or you sell slaves. So genocide means that we do not care. Therefore, genocide is possible because certain human lives are dispensable or ungrievable. The plan. The United States federal government should provide $10 billion to mine for rare earth elements under federal buildings in Washington, D.C. The United States federal government should provide $10 billion to mine for rare earth elements under federal buildings in Washington, D.C. The solvency. The first argument is that there's gold in them, there are hills. The ace pointer of this is that the Hudson Institute of the Mineralogy reports that,
climate change interacts with other human structures such as development to add more stress on ecosystems.
Human body and how it can be morphed, which means it's necessarily key. The third argument is tantalum is key to electronic equipment such as capacitors, resistors, making television also key to developing memory devices, making both of these elements integral to the specific technology. The Z point is the impacts. The first argument is that environmental destruction necessarily causes extinction. The ace point is that necessarily without decreases significantly the total number of CO2 in the atmosphere, it causes rampant ocean acidification, which kills off ocean fisheries, which the majority of the population rely on for sustenance. It causes resource wars that eventually cause extinction. The B point also is generally just that as things get hotter and hotter, it causes massive wildfires in the Amazon, which is a huge carbon buffer for the entire Earth, which eventually makes all life untenable as things just get hotter and hotter, and cause feedback loops that only make things worse. The C point is that you should prefer extinction as a prior question. It is literally inevitable in the status quo, and which means that it comes future, which means that maintaining the human rights is always going to be a prior question. The last argument is that necessarily that this is the key internally to resolving for structural violence. That point A is that the move towards the removal of the corporeal body and introduction of the cyborg vision allows us to resolve for things like identity conflicts that cause massive divides in the status quo, because it allows us to remove the eradication of difference through transhumanistic technology. Underview. The role of the battle is to endorse the fiat policy option that produces the best material conditions. Once again, the role of the battle is to endorse the fiat policy option that produces the best material conditions. The first argument is fiat. The ace of points that fiat is a test of hypothetical advocacy of answer speech acts. The base of points that fiat being illusory doesn't matter. Mirages, dreams, and hallucinations are all illusory, but they can still motivate action and create affective responses. The second argument is that fiat is good. The ace of points that fiat allows the oppressed to make demands upon the state independent of the state and conceive of a world where their demands are met. The base points that is critical to resolving harms. The question of it ought not be how great a utopia would be, but rather what material changes we can do to move towards that utopia. The ace of points that action spec is key. Fiat intrinsically requires the specification of who will take what action, absent identification of those two elements. It's impossible to predict outcomes, which means you vote an AFON presumption. The third argument is that policymaking is good. The ace point that policymaking is both particular and structural. It's not reform or revolution, it's reform and revolution, which justifies the perm as a key starting point. The B point also is that states are not static. There are organizations of power, which means it's only a question of what that power is used for. And we're open to flex.
I see a neuroplasticity supercharge all of our impacts. If you conclude that learning about potential plans to stop genocides is good, you vote for the affirmative. Number 2. The resolution poses the question of whether the United Nations should amend the convention. The plan is bad. B, focusing on pragmatic reform. Vague alternatives cause totalitarianism, mass violence through localized lens of policy cause making can begin to find ethical and solvent alternatives to state violence. Means that there's a fascism internal impact to any rejection of the affirmative. And Trump and Brexit make this uniquely key. Lack of engagement breeds material violence and fascist takeover. We also say is C, obsession with magnitude reflects a privileged conception of security that locks in the status quo. The 1% risk of any impact is methodological blackmail that prevents you from stopping to very real genocide. This creates a perpetual divide between us and the enemy that means constantly.
I'm going to do 3 off, and then I'm going to put the framework on top, and then the rest of the case is top down. Is anyone not ready?
Are there any secret back channels between the Ethiopian government and the Tigray region?
No. because they refuse to consider Tigray individuals to be
Okay, so how do you know that?
because that's an official statement. They
All right,
consider the Tigray individuals to be impure.
Yeah, they literally say that they're impure and that they are not worthy of any type of recognition. Why would you give a back channel to someone that you feel is subhuman or non-human?
So yeah, the key to being able to have any access in the round in the first place is going to be voter for education. And education is the only portable skill that will leave the round of issues for competing interpretations. Because competing interpretations is key to prevent judgment intervention. This operator because we know that we need to understand the parameters of the PMC before we're able to have the rest of the debate. The first is that UN credibility. The first argument that UN international credibility is low. The errors as of December 2020, about a quarter of countries haven't paid their dues. The unpaid dues in 2020 resulted in a budget shortfall of $5.1 billion. This hampered the UN's ability to conduct operations.
Children attempts to paper over the inherent gap in signification, generating a structural violence against current employee points, the fantasy of non-lacking child is impossible for the heteronormative society to refuse the acknowledging of the possibility of such equality and queerness as a barrier to realization of fantasies such as the queer body is constructed and enjoying expensive the child will be points out politics of futurity valorizes reproductive heteronormative sex subordinated gaze to nothing more than meaningless acrobatics. The C point is a refusal of the queerness to occupy a single stable category perceived as a threat to stability. The D point is look to the discourse on A's and
people. This is going to be the next DA. The next DA is going to be a U.S. lashback DA. Look to how in every single movement, when white people show up and start destroying things, the indigenous people or the people of color are the ones who get all of the lashback from the state, and massive amounts of violence are done against them. Things like Guantanamo Bay, where we just abduct people and commit massive amounts of violence against them and strip them of their autonomy and dehumanization, means that the affirmative not only can never solve for its own impacts and does nothing, but is a actually harmful way to think about the world and imagine fiat being carried out. Second, we're going to say that they have no solvency. Just because you destroy some land underneath some buildings,
to another building.
They just either move to another building, and also you're still destroying indigenous land. There could be people buried under those buildings. You don't know the sanctity of the ground they were built on. You are just destroying indigenous land. There are only 2 sites in the U.S. That's not going to solve water famine in lower income nations.
So it's going to be massive relooking much worse, but also we would indicate that you are also humanism and you're ready to preserve the human and be able to resolve this large magnitude is bad, but we would indicate the magnitude necessarily controls power ability, but also still outweighs, but also we would indicate in a world where you're not able to resolve, you have to default to the highest magnitude impact, because without just power ability, we just worry about the rain next. You say mad theory, we would indicate the U.S. uses nuts theory, which is nuclear utilization target strategy, which indicates that they like to posture low yield nuclear weapons, which indicates it's still able to resolve, but also your ability to be able to predict, like Ethiopian Tigray communications lines indicates that you absolutely are able to predict this, because having it public is necessarily key in the first place, i.e. that they like publicize this, which means that there's some sort of like ability to be able to predict these international relations.
May we have the text of the interpretation?
It's
So on the first interpretation, the articulation here is going to be we say that we are, like, our definition of RAs is necessarily going to be things that are hard to find, are factually difficult to find in the Earth surface. We say that RAs are literally are factionally uncommon or hard to find in the United States, which is probably why there's a shortage right now. They say that it doesn't matter because there's different starting point definition. But no, we say that interpretation is absolutely a question.
Is not the root cause. Their understanding of the queer is rooted in a bioessentialist logic that we have far surpassed. We will say this is a question of the otherization, but their warning is that the queer is otherized because they can't reproduce and therefore aren't considered meaningful in the pursuit of the child. But modern science has already undone this logic. We know that queer
the queer can reproduce and instead of folding them in their conception of futurity. Two implications: one, their biologist logic denies the progress you had to reframe the queer, which is the same logic they indict. Or two, the alt can't solve because it assumes the only action that denies queer futurity, but futurity is key to secure material gains for the queer. Four, anti-black is a better explanation of state logic. The idea that queer is the location of logic, that dire state action assumes that the queer is an intelligible identity, but the scales as an analysis of race demarcation always comes first when framing humanism because the black body is an object by which you base your understanding of human and non-human. Two implications: one, they're also because it misdiagnoses the base of humanism, which undermines who is otherized. Second, the black body is unaccounted for throughout their method because black futurity is key to gratuitous violence, meaning that they recreate anti-black violence, and that's the reason to reject on face. And the third point here is that we say we're wrong if you want, but Lacan is a huge portion of your literature.
All of their shit on the app is going to be defense at best. Start with the articulation that is toxic to plants. Well, they completely miss the interpretation of how this necessarily works. One, you should have read more research studies. Apparently we did, because we found the ones that weren't just about nickel. That's going to be the articulation that we give some specific plant we can't fucking pronounce, but this particularly is going to be able to extract landium. They say that this is going to be toxic to plants. We say it's like toxic if you just like no, we say it's not toxic to all plants, probably just to some, but the second articulation is going to be that the plants necessarily refine it, i.e. the plant the plant like pulls out the REE. It's a purification process. Yeah, it's a mining and purification process, which probably means that we resolve back for this. They say which probably means that we resolve back for this. Anyways, this is defense at best. We're not just talking about nickel. We literally give you 3 examples of like yttrium and other shit. Go down to their no solve. They say we know solve because we can't do foresights, but they even say articulation of these foresights are necessarily where the vast majority of REs are, specifically in the California areas that are going to be the main site right now, which means that these are where the wastewater is being generated.
Yeah, go to the links. You can extend across this route as a gosh darn simulation, that this natures and corrupts debate into an experience where a normal speech acts become a mockery of themselves. I.e., the 1AC is a mockery of decoloniality instead of an actual act of resistance. It's just another way for the world of propaganda to interpolate us as actors. This round is simulation because we've imagined it before and just mindlessly repeating pre-written scripts. We've debated y'all on this sort of thing. Pacific on Rees 3 times. All of yesterday was essentially Pacific versus Whitman. All this stuff. We were doomed to repetition of fruitless discourse that doesn't reflect the.
Which probably means people like to invest in things like NPL. That their articulation is going to be that the defense industry is necessarily going to get better because they have more REs, but the turn here is going to be consumer confidence. We say that right now the status quo inflation is necessarily being driven.
Cool. I'm bad at flowing. You said that the impact of the UN credibility dissent was inevitable, right?
I said the
This is the inter of the violations that you extract via plants. So the argument is that plants are distinct from mines. You have a wheat meat that says that plants are functionally mines, but a couple of responses. Number one is that, remember, the violation contextualizes the interpretation. The reason why is that the plants we contextualize via the violation that plants and mines are distinct, i.e. all of these standards level offenses reasons why plants are still unfair, even if it actually meets a definition of mine. Prefer the spirit of the interpretation, because otherwise you get frivolous wheat meats that don't respond to the substance of these standards level offense that we are reading. Second is that the standards are still dissets to your wheat meat, because even if your wheat meat is
the United States pulls out, which resolves any form of hegemony in the world. The United States hegemony is necessarily predicated on perception, i.e. how NATO necessarily views the United States as the link articulation that is going to be killer on the affirmative. You've conceded the credibility is the key internally to the United States hegemony. I'll do some work here. The first is going to be power projection is necessarily predicated on the ability to work with allies. Turkey houses B-61 gravity bombs within its borders, which indicates the ability for the United States to communicate, and the ability for the United States to power project through other countries indicates the only method the United States to have to be able to be a global hegemon is the indicate when that mass genocide is necessarily on CNN, and that people are necessarily being able to make predictions, i.e. that you say yourself that the Tigray region is necessarily distinct from Ethiopia, and that they cannot communicate, indicates that we can make predictions about the way in which the international order works. You've also conceded Gabe's articulation that nuts theory, nuclear utilization targeting strategy necessarily is the way the United States operates, which indicates there is absolutely a potential for great war, great power war, and nuclear escalation, which means that you are way behind in the
CP, and then the mining T-sheet, and then the solvency page of the app. Get my other papers out back. Alrighty. If we're all good, beginning now, you're gonna vote. You're clearly gonna vote for T because we are winning fairness over education offense, and there's no they are not winning any terminal defense on our page. But let's start with this CP. They're going to try and get up and go for this IVI.
This round means you are always voting neg. Let's go to the interview. This is where the collapse is going to be because this was the majority of their PMC. They're going to go for this articulation that they're a particularism, which means that even though there's specific bad things that happen, it doesn't work. The we mean is going to shield us because you consider you're not garnering any offense extra topically, but more importantly, you are particularly bad, particularly because the case turn is on fire in a world where you increase genocide not only via Seaburns but also within Nagorno-Karabakh because of the increase of conventional weapon usage. You're always going to be much worse. This indicates that it's never going to be.
They're like not competitive because they can both be true at the same time. Like we both have the definitions happen at the same time, which means they're not competitive.
Revolutionary fiat because our ethos is incoherent. There's absolutely no word as to how our ethos is incoherent. They say we have to smash they have to smash the symbols of the empire. We say that the affirmative and its use of revolutionary fiat is a form of smashing a literal symbol of the empire, which is the Capitol Hill, which means that our ethos is definitely consistent. This is the literal
necessarily proving the abuse, but you have made your own link and unique arguments that specifically use REMs in conjunction with REs. The implication being that obviously these things are intrinsically intertwined, and the fact that you had a dissent that specifically mentioned REMs probably indicates that this trick that they have in their underview, it's not going to work because they're going to cause extinction in two different ways, which means that you're always going to be good round, y'all.
Topic literature, which where we get our legal definitions and what impacts what we are actually looking for within topic literature. You look at the definition of from a legalistic standpoint that from the Department of Energy and EPA. This is most is most really applicable to what we're doing in policy and as policymakers.
Multiple precise definitions. There's literally not. They haven't provided all.
Yeah, they say there's multiple precise definitions, but literally not. They give no articulation of other precise definitions. However, we give you the best articulation.